on a wider level around the nation. So Catharine is the author and co-author of 6 books and numerous journal articles and book chapters. Since 2004, she has worked as a pro bono role, advising the National Rugby League on cultural change and education programs for players. Before entering academia in 2000, she was a journalist, an opinion writer, and has worked for the Sydney Morning Herald, the ABC, and the Bulletin magazine. She's on the editorial boards of the Public Communication Review, the International Journal of Cultural Studies, and Feminist Media Studies. She was a foundation chair of the Media and Communications Department at Sydney University and the foundation director of the Journalism and Media Research Centre at University of New South Wales. And probably her biggest claim to fame is that we went to school together.
That's actually one. Actually, I know nothing about this area.
Please do it, Catherine.
So, I mean, I should just say, because it's a bit confusing for people that I'm a professor of media, you know, what have I got to do with this sector? Well, 50% of my research has always been in gender studies, and I've always, I guess for 3 decades, have always tried to use some of my time pro bono to work supporting the fabulous people at the coalface in these areas who are really doing the most important work. But I'm going to share with you briefly today, and let me know how we're going for time, so I won't talk for too long, about an education, a research-based education program that I've pro bono, and I'm pro bono so I can be independent. I don't want to be paid for this kind of work. But pro bono I've been working with the National Rugby League, which is a very big organisation. And in doing that, I'll tell you about some research projects we worked on, but I've also partnered with Karen Willis, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia. So we worked together for 10 years. Why the NRL? Well, what was this about? So in 2004, the CEO of the NRL at the time, David Gallup, called me up because there was incident after incident, many involving domestic violence or alleged sexual assault. You know, as we know, an allegation of sexual assault so rarely translates into a conviction. But certainly there was a lot of evidence that that football players were engaging in everything from antisocial behaviour off the field through to harassment, violence, often involving women. And David Gallup said, look, you're a gender studies professor, what should we do? And I said, you don't do anything until you find out what's really happening. So the long story short is I led a very large research team that the NRL funded, but it was based at Sydney Uni, and we did a whole of culture map. So we talked to and surveyed or interviewed over 200 players, we did all the CEOs, clubs, coaches, and really got a very forensic picture, really, of the sort of off-field behaviours that were happening. And I can tell you the players were pretty open. It was interesting, a lot of those men wanted to talk about stuff that went on off the field and their concerns about it and their guilt in some cases. Not that I'm saying we should feel sorry for guys who behave badly, but it was just very interesting to begin to get a picture of what some of the behaviours were. So you can see how happy these guys look. This work, to kick off the research project, we held a big sort of forum and we invited a whole lot of men, as well as invited female partners, other women in league, to share what the research project was about, why we were doing it, and the fact that we were going to then develop education programs based on the evidence. So I just love the look on your face. They've got a whole lot of them, they're going to come listen to some feminists. Not that that's how we presented. We presented as people who were researchers and who were there to understand the culture better. One of the interesting things for me at the time was there was a lot of media interest in the fact that this research was happening, because football is NRL is a huge thing. And I'm showing you this because a lot of the commentators took what I would call a very moral approach to it. These guys are doing the wrong thing. All we have to do is go in and say, don't do this, and you'll solve it. They should just know what to do. So I want to come to this idea of an ethics-based approach to education and prevention in this area, not just with the NRL, but I think more broadly, I think we need to start in schools with this kind of approach. Okay, so you can see again Miranda Devine, Andrew Bolton, some of you will be familiar with this one. Miranda Devine, Bulldogs pay attention to the difference between right and wrong. It's that simple, apparently. You're talking about, by this stage you can see I was a very happy person. And then I worked out what you do is you surround yourself with your children and you can't be an equal person. I know it's awful, isn't it? children. So the interesting thing, the media coverage is interesting because coming back to the really important points that have been made, and they're both fabulous talks, is the way these things are framed in the media and often the invisibility of the real issues. You know, I mean, this has been the case with sexual assault, it's the case with coverage of legal trials. The complexity of the issues that Marianne brought out so beautifully, you know, is it's buried under an idea. I think people either don't want to know this is happening, or if they do know it's happening, it's a bunch of bad men. It's that simple. And, you know, as we all know, it's not that simple. And while I have, you know, don't get me wrong, I have zero tolerance for perpetration, I do think that if we look at the primary prevention and if we look at education and how we can start thinking about working before these things begin, particularly from families where there's been a cycle of violence, I think it behoves us to think about things at that end of the scale too. And you know, the NRL is very interesting because it's got it's a very culturally complex, diverse organisation. 36% of our players are Pacifica men, and that's, you know, vastly overrepresented compared to population of Pacifica's men in our culture generally in Australia. A lot of Indigenous players, as you know, and then there's a really broad range of backgrounds, family values, religious backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, and so it's an interesting place to work on research and evidence-based education. So what have we found? Because, to cut a long story short, I've led 2 very large research projects for the NRL. One in 2004, we really rolled out education grounded in what the research told us. And then in 2010, we repeated that research as a team. So we have benchmarks, so we could look at cultural shifts, and we did find positive shifts on the benchmarking indicators. And in 2015, I'm just in negotiations with the NRL about repeating the research because, you know, it's very clear that we need evidence and we need evaluation of these programs. We want to know how they're working. But, and obviously also we look internationally at programs in this area. I've got to say I think Australia is leading the way, not just in terms of the NRL work, but with people like Professor Moira Carmody at UWS, some of you might know of her work on sex and ethics. Again, Moira comes out of the background of working on domestic violence and sexual assault areas, but she increasingly got interested in the prevention end of things, which I think has to be part of the mix. So what do we know about a best practice approach? If you've got an organisation or a culture and you're thinking about, well, how do you begin to work with that organisation to promote cultural change around these issues? Researching the issues, design an education program based on what the research says the issues are. Use an ethics-based framework, I'll unpack that in a second. Okay, so with research, so these are some of the principles about research. It's got to be whole of culture. So one of the things with the NRL was everyone was talking about the players. You know, what interested me primarily is, well, what's the whole culture within this organisation? You know, so if you look at, say, alcohol management strategies, you know, there's a whole lot of education, when I came in, a lot of education aimed at players' alcohol management, but, you know, they get off the field and then they go up, you know, they'd be one of the staff out, they'd be called to the corporate box, and there's the CEO and all his friends in there, or, you know, pissed. So, you know, so I mean, that's a simple example, but it's a kind of question of, well, what are the values of the organisation, how they map to the play, everyone across it. Must be based on open questions. So another thing, I guess, with the research, and this is probably fairly obvious for everyone here, but, you know, we were very clear that we didn't go in making assumptions about what was or wasn't happening off the field or what the values and attitudes of players were bringing to off-field behaviour. We asked very open questions, and I think as a result we got very fulsome answers, and sometimes answers that made my head cold, but at least people talked. Most respect, understand the culture of the organisation. Again, this is obvious, but it's very much. I mean, it's interesting in working with the NRL. I find it fascinating the sort of stereotypes that float around about men who are perceived as working class, playing body contact sport. You know, I come from a working class background myself. I grew up in Newcastle, and so I'm probably fairly sensitive to class stereotypes. or I'm so very alert to them. And you know, because I'm now a sort of middle class woman, and I go to middle class dinner parties, and I mean the number of times I've sat next to a barrister or someone who said to me, "Oh, you know, you poor thing having to work with those men. You know they're all animals." You know, and those sort of animalistic stereotypes that are attached to men who play those kind of sports, I think are very interesting. And this ignores the complexity of the values, attitudes, behaviours, backgrounds of guys in this sort of environment. But I think they're very aware of that sort of animalising metaphor. It's certainly there. Evidence-based design programs. So with education, one of the reasons to do really good qualitative research is that what you can draw from that is real-world scenarios based in the language that people use, their understanding. And this is where I think really beginning to start work with young men in, I would argue, primary school even, but something that in a way is localised, that respects the culture and the experiences of, and I'm not saying just with men, I'm saying with young girls as well, but clearly there are different kinds of prevention work that we might want to be thinking about on the basis of gender. Drawing on the research to build scenarios, and I'll come back to that, well I'll say this now actually, one of the things we do is, in the actual education frameworks, we use hypotheticals. So we always have one external expert education provider, and we have trained players and ex-players in Murakami's Sex and Ethics Framework, which is a 6-week intensive training program on education, and it's around an ethics-based approach, which is not giving players or anyone else a list of do's and don'ts. It's about using hypotheticals, which are grounded in sort of experiences they have, and drawing them into responding to those, working through different ways of doing things. Sometimes we use theatre sports, that's been pretty successful. Humour is a large part of some of it. But ultimately the aim is getting the participants to reflect on different ways of doing things, but also a recognition that people bring different values in the room. And one of the interesting things, because I don't deliver the education but I've sat in, is with scenarios that involve sexual assault and violence against women, how in this kind of framework you'll find some men in the room challenging other men. So someone will say, I mean, the kind of rape risk stuff like, if she starts a sexual encounter at a certain point, she's got no right to stop it. And inevitably, some guys, particularly ones who haven't been through the programs before, in the room will say, yeah, well, she's a cop tease. That sort of mythology. And almost inevitably, in a room full of 25, 30 guys, there'll be a guy who's saying, my sister was raped. You don't know what that's like. And so the focus is very much on them beginning to recognise that they bring different experiences and values into that space and having an opportunity to share them. And that I think can be a very powerful tool in education. So sometimes sometimes it's about, sorry, I'll just quickly put this back up. Come on. Look, I don't need to finish the PowerPoint, I can just finish up. So the interesting thing, I think, is that sort of approach, in a way, if it's designed well, and it's obviously evaluation is critical in this space, and we refresh it. We refresh the program every year, so all players do it on an annual basis at least. The scenarios are changed. We evaluate that as well as doing the 5-year research. What's interesting is I think when you have a very male-dominated organisation like the NRL, and players are in teams and they're working, male bonding is a huge part of those sort of sports. Now that can be good in the sense that it can be about teamwork on the field. It can also be about very antisocial male bonding, and that's been a huge part of the problem off the field, particularly bonding over alcohol and those sorts of things, and often bonding by using women as kind of a bargaining chip in between men. No question. But what's interesting is that a lot of that stuff off the field has traditionally operated under a code of silence, what I would call a code of silence. And one of the interesting things about this sort of ethics-based framework is that it kind of breaks that code of silence down by bringing these stories out. And then what happens is guys in the same group start to see that they have different experiences, values and attitudes. You know, and I should just say, in sort of closing up on this, that Moira Carmody's Sex and Ethics program is really worth having a look at. It's up on her website. She's done a lot of research. I've done some research with Moira too. She's an absolutely fabulous researcher in this area. She's been doing it for 35, 40 years. And she's very successfully used this program, you know, in a whole range of other contexts, other organisational, community-based contexts. So I've been talking about the NRL, which is a very specific kind of project, but in a way that's been part of testing the efficacy of Moira's work. But I think her work is very interesting. So if anyone's interested in prevention-based, ethics-based education, go and have a look at C-A-R-M-O-D-Y, Carmody. Her work is terrific, I think. And I guess the final thing I'll say is that, you know, I've now been working pro bono with the NRL for 10 years. And the reason I've continued is I've seen fantastic evidence of buy-in. They put resources in. There are a whole lot of men in that organisation who are now trained up. And talking about a feminist philosophy, which is really a lot of what this research and this education is grounded in. What's fascinating is I was sitting in a Welfare and Education Committee meeting the other day, which is the body that oversees welfare and education, and a guy that I've sort of collaborated with on some of this education stuff on and off, said, and he's an ex-player, he was a very hard man on the field, but he's a lovely guy off the field, and there was a new member of the committee and they were asking about this program and this education, and I just turned to them and said, well, you know, it's an ethics-based framework. I understand it's sort of Foucauldian. In reference to Michel Foucault, a philosopher that a lot of feminists have used in their work. And I went, yeah, it is nice, that's right. So if they actually, some of them are actually using the language that we would use, and I think that that's interesting. And a lot of people think that is bizarre. But if you think they've also been partnered with what was Rape Crisis New South Wales, it's now Rape and Domestic Violence Services Australia, for 10 years, they're not really the organisation that you would think would have partnered with that organisation, but they do, and they also, as they should, put some substantial funding towards these issues. So thanks.